And our tree is full of leaves, and by the end it'll be full of bleeding hearts as well. We've got some presents at the bottom of the tree, and if you brought presents today, I think the best time to bring them to the front will be after the service. Otherwise, we'll have a bit of a bottleneck during communion. So if you brought presents to add to the collection under the tree, as soon as the service is done, when we've said our benediction, feel free to bring it to the front and we'll add it to the collection. So thank you, Cliff, for bringing us the word from Mark. We're still with Jesus, and he's still in a feisty mood. He's still at the temple talking to people about what the kingdom really is and how it's different to what they imagine. If we just go back to that reading for a second. Now, in church, we've often told these two stories as if they are separate units, as if they've got nothing to do with each other. So we often talk about the widow story, and we know it quite well, but there shouldn't really be any division between what happens with the widow's offering and what Jesus says about the scribes. Let's go back to the first one. Jesus has just finished talking to the scribes. In fact, he's just called one of the scribes good, a man who's not far from the kingdom of God. This is in Mark chapter 12, verses 28 to 34. He's just called one of them good, and now he says to the people, everyone's listening to him, he says, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at the banquets. They devour widows' houses, but for the sake of appearance they say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. We've got to do a bit of work on this passage because the translation doesn't help us very much. What Jesus actually says is not beware of the scribes. The Greek there says beware of those scribes who like to walk. There's a difference, isn't there? Instead of referring to the scribes as a whole, he's talking about specific scribes, specific individuals in that scribal community who like to walk around with long robes and fancy clothes, but never get them dirty, who like to sit at the fancy places, at the synagogues and at the banquets, who devour widows' houses. Now, what we think that means is the scribes were in charge of looking after widows, orphans, all those who were marginalized and impoverished. They would take the offerings that come into the temple, and they would make sure that the temple can run, and there are offerings and things and wine and bread and all the other things to go. But they would also take a portion of that money and make sure that the widows are cared for. Because of course, women had no financial or economic autonomy in Jesus' time. And so if you lost your husband, you were poor. And you had no one to care for you. And if your husband didn't happen to have any brothers, no one was going to marry you either, because you are a widow. You're no longer a young woman to be taken as a first bride. And so part of the scribe's job, this is in Leviticus, it's in Deuteronomy as well, is to specifically take care of the widows. And yet Jesus says some of these men abuse their position by taking in all this money, but then not caring for those who need it most, and in effect devouring their houses. And then he adds a bit of insult to injury. He says, and while they're devouring these people's houses behind the scenes, where we can all see, they say long prayers for the sake of appearances. They will receive the greater condemnation. Next slide. He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people brought in large sums. A poor widow came in and put in 2 small copper coins. Now here, we must also make a distinction. Jesus is not talking about all widows. He's talking about a poor widow here. And in that, as we've said and prayed, we can see God's care for all those who are impoverished, who live in poverty. But it's important here that Jesus is not talking about all scribes, and he's not talking about all widows. He's talking about the scribes who he's attacking in that passage, and he's talking about this widow here in this story. Jesus goes to sit in the treasury. Now, this is interesting. In the temple, of course, there were parts that the men could access, and there were parts that the women could access. And the women couldn't access the parts that the men could access, but everyone had to have access to where the money was being brought, because that's only that's good commerce. And so in the treasury, the part of the temple where the money is collected, there were these big chests, big boxes, where people brought their offerings. And to make sure that no one could stick their hands into the boxes to reach in and take coins out, at the top of the boxes, they had big, large ram's horns to act as a funnel for the money going into the chest. And so you had a ram's horn, or perhaps maybe a buffalo horn or something, that's nice and wide at the opening, and it funnels down and leads into this chest. And what people used to do, the reason Jesus is sitting there and all the people are watching, is the rich would come in, and they very quickly figured out that if we throw these coins in from high enough, the whole temple can hear the amount of coins rattling, ringing, rolling down into the chest. And it became a bit of a competition to see who could put in the most money, who could make the most noise, throwing these coins down the ram's horn into the chest. And so many people came, many rich people, put in large sums. You can almost imagine them taking bags of coins and turning them over the way we just did, and rolling, rattling, roaring down into this chest. And the more you had, the more you gave, and the more people heard, the more noise they heard, they held you in higher esteem. But there's another lady there. She's a widow. To call her poor is wrong. She's broke. She has nothing. It's not true. She has two coins, which are worth a penny. She comes into this room with this cacophony of sound and ringing chests and coins and rich people. And she brings 2 coins, and she walks to the chest and she puts them in. Ding, ding. 2 sounds, 2 coins hitting the chest. And if you can imagine how the people would have thought about those who brought big bags of money, you can imagine what they would have been saying or thinking about this poor widow who brought only 2 coins. Jesus is sitting, and he has just been speaking to the crowds. This time he turns to his disciples. He wants to tell them something in private. He says to them, I want to tell you something. This woman, who you're all snickering at, has put in more than all the others, because she did not put in anything from her abundance. She gave everything she had, all she had to live on. That part is mistranslated as well. The word there in Greek is not all she had to live on. The word there is all her life. She put in all her life. Now we can wag our fingers at Jesus and say, Jesus, no, people are worth more than money, But Jesus understood, as I think on a certain level all of us understand, that when you do not have money to buy your children food, that is life. There are 3 words in Greek in the New Testament. Next slide, Doug. Chris, I don't know who has the clicker. Next one. And the next one. Put the next one on. There we go. And then we'll go back. Okay, keep that one on. There are 3 words in the New Testament in Greek that describe the word we have as life in English. The first is this, bios, biology, biography. The second is psyche, or psyche, what we might call your mental state of living. And the last is zoe, which is a deeper, more intimate life that God gives. When Jesus, for example, says, I've come to give life and life in abundance in the Gospel of John, he's saying, I've come to give zoe, and Zoe in abundance. But here he says bios, physical life, the blood running through your veins, the air going through your lungs. Jesus says, this woman has put in all her life, her physical being. And he's not talking about money. He's talking about a dependence on God that sometimes comes to us clearest when we have nothing else to give. The widow is standing there. She puts in 2 coins. Jesus calls it all her life. The people laugh. The disciples must have thought, what does he mean? Jesus understood that sometimes giving all your life seems somewhat meaningless. It might seem meaningless to other people. It might seem meaningless to you. What do I have to give? What is my life worth? What have I done? Every good thing I've done, I've cancelled out with 3 bad things. It's almost as if Jesus says, it's not the point. The point is giving everything, all you have. Now, if there's a passage that's been slightly abused in the church's history to convince people to give more money, it's probably this one. It's probably the one that tries to convince us that the moral of the story is for all of us to give more of what we have, because of course, if you empty your wallet, you're giving more of your life. But that's not the point of the story. I would go so far as to say there isn't even a moral lesson in the story. The story is simply about how and where and when God's kingdom shines through in the world. And Jesus says his kingdom shines through when a poor widow who has nothing to give gives her last 2 coins. What is the thing that you must give? Not talking about your money. What is the thing that you must give for Christ to say you have given all your life? For some people it might be their careers, might be their dreams, their ambitions. Some people it might be a brand new car you bought, and that's fine as well. There's no moral judgment in the story. There's simply the statement that Christ makes when he says, when a widow gives 2 cents, she is giving more than everyone who brings money just to be heard, just to be seen. She's giving more than the scribes who give their lives studying the Bible, going off to theological college, coming back and leading people in understanding the word. They devour the houses of widows who give everything they have. You can't understand the widow if you don't understand the scribes. Jesus is not just talking about the humble, moral, good act of the widow. He's talking about how much better she is than all the scribes combined, all those scribes who he's talking about anyway, who like the fancy seats in the high places, but do not give all their lives. Let's put the next slide on and just keep it there. Biography. Bios, physical life. Graphe, how is your life written? We love biographies. We love true stories, with good reason. How will your biography be written? How will people remember how you spent your physical life? Will you be remembered for taking, like the scribes? Or will you be remembered for giving, like the widow? And you'll say, well, Fritz, the obvious answer is giving. And you're right. And the next thing you might say is, but I have nothing to give. If it's not about my money, what can I give? If it's not about my career, what can I give? it's meaningless. Nothing I can give can change anything for anyone. I might liquidate my assets and give them to the soup kitchen, and those people might eat well for 10 days or maybe 20 days. But that's all I can give. It's actually quite meaningless, quite absurd in the bigger scheme of things. Well, I want to tell you about something. I want to tell you about something that was considered in its time absolutely and utterly meaningless. I want to tell you about something that was worth less to the people who were there, who condemned him, than the widow's 2 coins. I want to tell you about the body and the blood of Christ, and how everyone there thought it was meaningless that this man would claim to die for the salvation of all people. And yet, when he was with his disciples, not long after these events in the temple, and they were eating and having a good time, he took bread and he broke and he gave it to them and he said, "Take. It's only bread, but eat. This is my body. Remember the price paid for your sins, even if the world calls it meaningless." After they had taken the bread, he took the wine. He said, "Take, drink, remember that even if the world calls it meaningless, this is the blood that seals the new covenant for you." Maybe all you have is 2 cents. Maybe you have something else. Maybe God has been speaking to you, is speaking to you about the thing you must give that is all your life. And maybe today's communion can help all of us to better understand what that is, who it's for, where in your heart it resides. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to install communion.
How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that He should give His only Son to make a wretch His treasure. How great the pain of searing loss! The Father turned His face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory. Behold the man upon the cross, my sin upon His shoulders. Ashamed I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held Him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me